The last letter was never answered. It sits in a museum in Aleppo, Syria, or it did, before the Syrian civil war made the fate of the museum's collections uncertain. A clay tablet inscribed in cuneiform, sent from the king of Ugarit to the king of Lycia, which is probably what we now call Cyprus. The tablet is dated approximately to around 1190 BCE, give or take a decade. The king of Ugarit is writing in desperation. His ships, he explains, are not in harbour. They have been sent somewhere, perhaps to Anatolia, for reasons we can no longer recover. His grain stores are empty. He is facing, from the sea, enemies he calls the peoples of the sea, and they are burning his towns and doing things to his people that the cuneiform vocabulary he uses implies but does not fully describe. He needs ships, he needs grain, he needs soldiers. He writes, "Do not be angry with me. The matter is urgent." The letter was never sent, or rather, it may have been sent, and the copy was retained in the palace archives. And when the palace at Ugarit burned completely, burned so thoroughly, that the archaeological evidence shows the entire city was abandoned and never reoccupied. The copy burned with everything else, and was preserved by accident. The clay tablet hardened, rather than destroyed by the fire that destroyed everything around it. The king of Lycia never answered, either because the letter never reached him, or because Lycia itself was under attack, or because there was simply no longer anyone in a position to help. We do not know. We know only the letter, and the urgency of it, and the silence that followed. The Bronze Age collapse. The name is both accurate and inadequate. It is accurate because the collapse happened in the Bronze Age, in the late 2nd millennium BCE, when the dominant civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East were organized around the use of bronze as their primary metal technology, and when the international trade networks that supplied the copper and tin necessary to make bronze were some of the most elaborate commercial systems the ancient world had yet produced. It is inadequate because collapse suggests something sudden, a single dramatic event that happened and then was over, when what actually happened was something slower and stranger and more terrifying in its gradualness. A system-wide failure that spread across decades and affected cultures that had nothing obvious in common except their participation in the specific international order of the Late Bronze Age. Let me tell you what was there before it ended, because the Late Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean was not a primitive world struggling towards civilization. It was a sophisticated, interconnected, cosmopolitan world of palace economies and long-distance trade and diplomatic correspondence and specialized craft production that had been building for centuries. And at its height, in the period from roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE, it represented something that had not existed before and would not exist again in that specific form for centuries after. The palace at Knossos on Crete, its walls painted with the vivid frescoes that show us the Minoan world, the bull leapers and the processions and the dolphins and the blue-painted monkeys gathering saffron. The palace at Mycenaean in the Greek Peloponnese, with its lion gate and its shaft graves stuffed with gold, and its elaborate bureaucratic records in Linear B. The Mycenaean script that would be deciphered in 1952 by the architect Michael Ventris and revealed as an early form of Greek, a discovery so surprising that Ventris initially could not believe his own analysis, because no one had imagined that the Greek language was old enough to have been written in the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire centered at Hattusa in Anatolia, whose military power had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, and whose diplomatic correspondence with Egypt was conducted in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, because the Hittites and the Egyptians needed a shared language for the specific purpose of making peace. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, not the capital of any empire, but one of the most commercially important cities in the ancient world, a cosmopolitan trading city where merchants from Egypt and the Aegean and Anatolia and Cyprus and Canaan all maintained commercial relationships, where scribes were trained in 5 languages, where the specific material evidence of the Late Bronze Age international trade survives in extraordinary density. And then there was Egypt. Egypt, which was old when all of these were young, which had survived the disruption of the Hyksos invasion and the theological revolution of Akhenaten's monotheism and the chaos of the years after his death, and which in the 19th dynasty under Ramesses II had reached what looked like a new peak of imperial power. Egypt did not collapse entirely in the Bronze Age collapse. It was the only major civilization to survive in some form, though severely diminished. But Egypt, in the period after the collapse, was no longer what it had been. The new kingdom's imperial ambition, the construction projects that had produced Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, and the additions to Karnak, the military capacity that had allowed Egyptian armies to campaign in the Levant and Nubia simultaneously, all of this contracted in the 2 centuries after 1200 BCE into something smaller and more inward-looking, a civilization that was retreating from the world rather than projecting itself into it. The international trade network that connected all of these civilizations was one of the most impressive things about the late Bronze Age world, and it is important to understand it clearly because the collapse of this network was central to the collapse of the civilizations that depended on it. The copper for bronze came primarily from Cyprus, hence the name, from the Latin cuprum, which derives from the Greek kypros. Cyprus had the copper deposits. The copper was extracted, smelted into the standard trade ingot form called the oxide ingot for its characteristic shape, loaded onto ships and traded across the Mediterranean to wherever bronze working was practiced, which was everywhere. The tin that completed the bronze alloy came from even further away, from Afghanistan or Anatolia or possibly from the British Isles. The specific source still debated by archaeologists. Tin was rarer than copper, and the trade routes that supplied it were longer and more complex. A ship at the bottom of the Mediterranean, the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of southwestern Turkey in 1982 by a sponge diver and excavated over the following decade by archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, is the best surviving physical evidence of the late Bronze Age international trade at its height. The ship sank around 1300 BCE. The dating is from the cargo, particularly from a scarab of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti found among the goods, and it was carrying, when it went down, a cargo so varied and so cosmopolitan that its manifest reads like a compendium of the international trade network it served. 10 tons of Cypriot copper in oxide ingot form, a ton of tin ingots, ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa, glass ingots, another luxury trade commodity of the period, from Egypt, terebinth resin from the Levant, used for incense and perfume, pomegranates from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, Cypriot pottery, Canaanite pottery, Mycenaean pottery, scarabs from Egypt, a gold scarab of Queen Nefertiti, a Canaanite merchant's cylinder seal, a Mycenaean merchant's cylinder seal, a stone anchor from the ship itself, of a type that was used in the Levantine coastal trade, and the personal possessions of the merchants and crew who went down with it, gold jewellery, bronze tools and weapons, the specific material accumulation of people whose lives were organised around movement through the eastern Mediterranean, carrying the commodities that made the Bronze Age world function. This ship is the Bronze Age trade network made physical. It is not an anomaly or an exceptional case. The cargo types it carries are documented in the palace archives and in the diplomatic correspondence of the period as standard commodities of the international trade. It is one ship, and there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of such ships working the eastern Mediterranean routes in the centuries when the trade was at its height. The network was dense, it was well organised, it was, in the specific sense that the palace economies of the period depended on it, essential to the continuation of civilization as the late Bronze Age understood it. And then the ships stopped coming. This is not a metaphor. The archaeological evidence from the collapse period shows the cessation of the specific pottery styles and the specific imported goods that mark the late Bronze Age international trade. The Mycenaean pottery that appears across the eastern Mediterranean in the period before 1200 BCE, in Egypt, in Cyprus, in the Levant, in Anatolia, stops appearing. The oxide copper ingots stop appearing. The specific goods that the Uluburun ship was carrying stop appearing in the archaeological record, because the ships carrying them stopped sailing, or were destroyed, or had nowhere left to go. What happened? This is the question that has occupied the archaeologists and historians who study the Bronze Age collapse for the past century. And the honest answer, the answer that the actual evidence supports, rather than the cleaner answers that narrative satisfaction demands, is that we don't know fully. We have theories, several of them, and each has genuine evidentiary support, and none of them alone seem sufficient to explain the scale of what happened. The most intellectually satisfying conclusion that the current scholarship has reached is that the collapse was the product not of one cause, but of several causes interacting in ways that amplified each other. A cascade of failures that began with one or two weaknesses and ended by bringing down an entire system, the Sea Peoples. The Egyptian records, particularly the inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Luxor, which are the most detailed contemporary account of the events of the collapse period, describe attacks by confederations of peoples from the sea, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. The names appear in the Egyptian texts, though their identification with specific historical populations is one of the most debated questions in ancient history. The Peliset are widely understood to be the Philistines of the biblical tradition, who settled in Canaan after the Egyptian period. The others are more uncertain: the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Anatolians displaced by the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the peoples of Cyprus and the Aegean, all have been proposed as components of the Sea Peoples Confederation, which may not have been a single confederation at all, but a series of related migration events, driven by the same underlying causes that were affecting everyone else. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe the Sea Peoples as a force that had already destroyed several civilizations before reaching Egypt. They destroyed Hatti, the Hittites, they destroyed Lycia, Cyprus, they destroyed Arzawa and the cities of Canaan. This account, if accurate, would make the Sea Peoples a primary cause of the collapse. But there is a problem with this interpretation, and it is the problem that haunts the study of the Bronze Age collapse more generally. The Egyptian records are propaganda, produced to celebrate Egyptian victories over their enemies, and we cannot straightforwardly trust them as neutral historical accounts. Ramesses III needed his inscriptions to say that Egypt had defeated a terrible enemy. The more terrible the enemy, the greater the victory. We cannot be certain how much of what the inscriptions say about the Sea Peoples' prior destruction of other civilizations was accurate historical report, and how much was the rhetorical construction of a worthy foe: climate change. The climate of the Eastern Mediterranean is not now, and has never been entirely stable, and the period around 1200 BCE was, according to the evidence of pollen samples and isotope analysis and the study of ancient climate proxies, a period of significant climate disruption. A prolonged drought, perhaps 2 or 3 generations of reduced rainfall, would have had devastating consequences for the agricultural economies of the Aegean and the Levant, where the palace economies depended on agricultural surplus to sustain their populations and fund their activities. A drought severe enough to reduce the grain harvest by 20 or 30% would have made the palace redistribution systems that characterized the Bronze Age economy increasingly unable to meet their obligations, unable to feed the dependent populations, unable to pay the specialist craftspeople, unable to maintain the military capacity that protected the trade routes. The specific evidence for late Bronze Age climate change has grown considerably in the past decade. Isotope analysis of speleothems, the mineral deposits in caves that record past climate conditions, from the Eastern Mediterranean shows a period of significantly reduced rainfall in the late 2nd millennium BCE. Pollen records from lake sediments show a decline in agricultural pollen and an increase in drought-resistant plant species in the same period. And in the archaeological record, the storage jars in the palace storerooms of the late Bronze Age sites show, in some cases, evidence of diminishing quantities before the final destruction, the stores running down before the end, rather than being well supplied at the moment of catastrophe. If the climate dried, the grain failed. If the grain failed, the palace economies could not maintain their dependent populations. If the palace economies collapsed, the specialized craftspeople who made the bronze weapons and the pottery and the elaborate luxury goods of the late Bronze Age trade dispersed. If the craftspeople dispersed, the goods stopped being made. If the goods stopped being made, the trade that had moved them stopped being profitable. If the trade stopped being profitable, the merchants stopped sailing. And if the merchants stopped sailing, the copper and the tin that made the bronze stopped reaching the places that needed them, and the weapons that the armies needed could not be made, and the armies that protected the trade routes could not function, and the trade routes that had sustained the palace economies for centuries ceased to operate. This is the cascade, the specific mechanism by which one failure amplified another, the way that the interconnected system of the late Bronze Age international order became, at a certain point, more vulnerable to disruption than a less interconnected system would have been. The Bronze Age world was, in a specific sense, too integrated. The individual palace economies were too dependent on the international trade for commodities they could not produce locally. The international trade was too dependent on the security that the palace economies provided, and when the security failed, the trade failed with it. And when the trade failed, the palace economies that depended on it could no longer sustain themselves. The earthquakes, the archaeological evidence from a number of late Bronze Age sites shows destruction layers that are consistent with seismic activity rather than with fire alone. Specific patterns of building collapse that earthquake engineers recognize as the signature of seismic events. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean is a seismically active region, and it has been proposed that a sequence of major earthquakes in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE may have contributed to the destruction of specific sites. Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, and other major Mycenaean centers show evidence of destruction that may include seismic components. If earthquakes weakened the palace structures and killed people and disrupted the administrative systems at the same time as drought was reducing the agricultural surplus, the combined pressure might have been sufficient to overwhelm the resilience of the palace economies, the internal rebellions. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were redistributive systems, taking resources from the countryside and the merchant class and the specialist craftspeople and concentrating them in the palace for redistribution according to the palace's own priorities. This system worked well when there was enough surplus to go around, when the agricultural production was sufficient to feed everyone and still leave something for the palace's administrative apparatus and luxury production. When the surplus contracted, as climate change would have caused it to do, the redistributive system became increasingly extractive, taking more from the countryside to maintain the palace's obligations, reducing the living standards of the agricultural population, generating the specific resentment that had historically, in many times and places, produced revolt. The Linear B tablets from Pylos, one of the major Mycenaean palace sites in the Greek Peloponnese, show, in the records from the period shortly before the palace's final destruction, an unusual concentration of administrative activity around the palace's defences. The tablets record the deployment of watchers along the coast and the allocation of rowers to the fleet, activities that suggest the palace administration was aware of a threat and was organising its defences in the last period before the destruction that the archaeology confirms. Were they defending against external raiders, the sea peoples or pirates or migrating groups? Were they defending against internal revolt by a population that had been squeezed too hard by the palace extraction? The tablets do not tell us. They give us the administrative record of the preparations without the context of what those preparations were responding to. I want to give you a specific place and a specific moment of ending, because the Bronze Age collapse is most vivid not in the abstract patterns of systemic failure, but in the specific evidence of what it looked like when a specific civilization at a specific place reached its end. Ugarit, the city on the Syrian coast, population perhaps 8,000 people in its final period, one of the most important commercial cities in the late Bronze Age world. The archaeological evidence of its destruction is unusually detailed because the fire that destroyed the palace preserved an extraordinary archive of clay tablets. The palace correspondence, the administrative records, the commercial documents, the literary texts, the language training exercises of the scribal school, that give us a window into the city's life and its ending that no other site in the Bronze Age world can match. The king of Ugarit in the final period was named Ugarit. He was young. The tablets suggest he had not been on the throne long before the end, and he was, in the last months of the city's existence, in a state of desperate diplomatic activity, exchanging letters with the king of Carchemish in northern Syria, with the Hittite viceroy in the north, with the king of Lycia across the sea. The letters show a ruler who understood that something terrible was happening, and who was trying, within the diplomatic conventions of the late Bronze Age, to organize a response to it. One of the letters Amurapi received from the king of Lycia is worth quoting in its sense, because it gives the specific character of the danger that was closing in from multiple directions. The king of Lycia writes to say that he has seen the enemy ships from his city, that they are doing terrible things, and that he does not have enough ships to help Ugarit because his own cities are under attack. He advises Amurapi to be strong, to look to his own defences, and adds, in a phrase that the scholars have found haunting, that where the enemy has now camped, They are setting up a fortified camp in the middle of the land. The enemy is not merely raiding, they are settling. Hammurabi's response, in another letter preserved in the archive, is the one that strikes me most deeply. He writes that his soldiers are in the land of the Hittites, and his ships are in Lycia, and that the city is therefore undefended. He writes that he has no grain, no silver, no bronze. He writes, "I have nothing to send, there is nothing I can do, there is nothing I can do." The language of the tablet is polite and formal, as the conventions of late Bronze Age diplomacy required, but underneath the formality is a specific quality of exhaustion and despair. The recognition that the resources have run out, that the system that sustained the city has ceased to function, that the letter he is writing may be the last letter he will send, and that no help is coming. The palace burned, the scribe's room and the merchant's quarter and the administrative offices burned. The tablets fell into the debris and were covered by ash and rubble, and for 3,000 years they waited. The city was never reoccupied. The specific archaeologist's observation that a site shows no post-destruction occupation layer is one of the clearest indicators of catastrophic abandonment, and Ugarit has no post-destruction occupation. The people who survived the burning did not come back. The people who came later passed by on the coast road and did not stop, or did not know that a city had been there, or knew it had been there, and found nothing worth rebuilding. The Mycenaean world ended differently. Not in a single catastrophic burning, but in a series of destructions spread over decades, beginning around 1200 BCE and continuing into the following century, site by site, palace by palace. Some sites were destroyed and briefly reoccupied and then abandoned. Some were destroyed and immediately abandoned. A few small communities survived in isolated locations, maintaining a reduced form of Bronze Age culture for a generation or two before those too faded into the specific poverty of the Greek Dark Ages. The writing system, Linear B, disappeared. The palace economies disappeared. The specialized craft production disappeared. The international trade disappeared. The specific form of Greek culture that had built Mycenaean Tiryns and Pylos, that had sent its ships to Troy, if Homer's tradition preserves anything real about the period, disappeared. What replaced it was not nothing. People continued to live in the Aegean. They continued to work bronze in reduced quantities. They continued to bury their dead. They continued to tell stories. But the stories they told are not the stories we can read in Linear B, because Linear B disappeared with the palace economies that had used it. The Greek that we know, the Greek of Homer and Hesiod and the tragedians, emerged in the following centuries from the Dark Age communities that had survived the collapse, speaking a language that was recognizably the language preserved in the Linear B tablets, but organized in a different world, a world without palaces and without bureaucracies and without the elaborate international trade network that had required the invention of writing in the first place. Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, whatever their complex relationship to the historical events of the Bronze Age, and scholars have debated this relationship for centuries without resolution, are the products of the Dark Ages, the centuries after the collapse, composed by a tradition of oral poets who were telling stories about a world that had ended, a world that had been magnificent and was now gone, a world whose ruins were visible on the hillsides of the Greek landscape. The great walls of Mycenae, the Lion Gate, the massive construction that the later Greeks attributed to the Cyclopes, because no one could imagine human beings building such things. These were visible reminders of a past that the Greeks of the historical period understood as the Age of Heroes, a time when the world had been larger and more powerful and more beautiful than their own reduced circumstances. The Iliad opens with the plague in the Greek camp before Troy. In that opening, the gods are immediately and powerfully present. Apollo sends the plague, Achilles prays, and the goddess Thetis rises from the sea to help her son. Zeus nods his assent to what will happen, and all of Olympus shakes. The mythological framework of the Iliad, the direct involvement of divine beings in human events, the specific way that the gods choose sides and intervene and manipulate and are moved by the human suffering they observe, is not naive supernatural thinking. It is the specific cosmological inheritance of a Bronze Age world in which the relationship between the human and the divine was understood as continuous and immediate. The Dark Age poets who composed the Iliad were looking back at a world in which the gods had been, in some sense, present in a way that they no longer were, and they were preserving that world in the only medium they had, the spoken word, the narrative, the story told at the feast in the hall of a Dark Age chieftain who was nothing like the palace kings his poets sang about. The specific human beings who lived through the collapse and survived it are almost entirely invisible to us. We have the tablets, the letters and the administrative records and the commercial documents from the period before the end. We have the archaeology, the destruction layers, the abandonment evidence, the occasional burial that tells us about the people who died. But we do not have personal testimony from the people who lived through the crisis, who watched their world end and had to decide what to do next. We do not know how the Quipucamayok of the Late Bronze Age, the scribes, the administrators, the specialists in the specific knowledge that the palace economy required, experienced the collapse of the system that had given their skills meaning. We do not know whether they understood what was happening, whether they watched the crisis building with a sense of doom, or whether they were surprised by its speed, whether they tried to adapt or simply fled or did not survive. What we do know, from the specific patterns of the archaeological record, is that some people moved. The evidence of population movement in the decades around 1200 BCE is extensive. The specific pottery styles and the specific burial practices of the Mycenaean world appear in Cyprus and in the Levant in ways that suggest migration rather than trade, people rather than goods moving across the eastern Mediterranean. Some of the sea peoples themselves may have been refugees from the Aegean and Anatolia, people displaced by the disasters in their home regions and moving in groups that became a military and demographic pressure on the civilizations they encountered. The destroyers may have been, in some cases, the destroyed, the dark that followed. The Greek Dark Ages, roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, are dark primarily in the sense of the historical records near silence. Writing had disappeared, monumental construction had stopped, the long-distance trade had ceased, and the population of the Aegean may have declined by 50 to 75% in some regions in the 2 centuries after the collapse. This is not the darkness of ignorance or savagery, it is the specific darkness of a world that had lost its administrative apparatus, its specialized knowledge, its material surplus, and much of its population, and was surviving in reduced communities that did not yet have the resources or the organizational capacity to produce the written records and the monumental architecture that are the historian's primary materials. In this darkness, the stories were told. The oral tradition that preserved what would eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey was active in the Dark Ages, maintaining in narrative form the memory of a world that had been larger and richer than the present. The Dark Age communities that survived the collapse were communities with a specific kind of memory, the memory of loss, of the world that had been before, of the palaces and the ships and the trade and the power that had been and were no longer. And from that memory, from that specific combination of survival and loss, the Greek tradition that would eventually produce the classical civilization and everything that descended from it was forming. The question the Bronze Age collapse asks us. It is a question that historians of the ancient world rarely ask explicitly, because the explicit asking of it makes them sound like something other than historians. But it is there, in the evidence, and in the silence after the evidence runs out, and I think it deserves to be asked directly. How does a civilization end? Not how does a civilization decline? The long, slow processes of economic and political and military deterioration are well studied. But how does it end? Completely, suddenly, in the sense that the people who were living in it one generation find themselves, in the next generation, in a different world. A world that is recognizably descended from what came before, but is no longer the same thing, is no longer characterized by the same institutions and the same practices and the same network of relationships that made it what it was. The Bronze Age collapse tells us that a civilization can end very quickly, that a system which has been building for centuries can collapse in decades, that the specific interconnections that made a civilization sophisticated and productive can become, under certain conditions, the specific vulnerabilities that make it incapable of withstanding disruption. The late Bronze Age international order was complex, it was efficient, it was capable of producing extraordinary things, and it was fragile in the specific way that complex, efficient systems are fragile. It had little redundancy. It depended on the smooth functioning of many interdependent parts, and when the parts began to fail, when the climate dried and the harvests contracted and the migrations began and the raiding increased and the trade routes became unsafe, The failure cascaded faster than any individual part of the system could respond. We are not the Bronze Age. Our world is vastly more complex, vastly more interconnected, and has resources and capabilities that the Bronze Age world could not have imagined. But the specific structure of vulnerability, the way that interconnected complexity creates efficiencies that also create fragilities, is not a Bronze Age problem. It is a problem that any complex civilization faces in any period. The question of how much interconnection makes a system strong and how much makes it fragile, of how to maintain the benefits of integration while preserving the resilience that allows survival when integration fails. This is a question that the Bronze Age collapse poses to anyone who spends time with it, and it is a question that does not resolve into a comfortable answer. The letter from Ugarit is still there, in its museum, if the museum still stands. The king is still writing, in the cuneiform that the scribes of the late Bronze Age world used. He is asking for ships, he is asking for grain, he is saying that there is nothing he can do. The letter was never answered. But here is the thing I find most remarkable about the Bronze Age collapse, and about the centuries that followed it. The world did not end. The people who survived, reduced in number, impoverished, dislocated, often far from where they had begun, continued. The Greeks who came through the Dark Ages built, eventually, the civilization that produced Homer and Herodotus and Thucydides and the Parthenon, and the specific way of thinking about the world that we recognize as the origin of much of what we value. They did not do this quickly. It took centuries, and the specific path from the Dark Age survivors to the classical civilization is not straight or simple. But they did it. The Phoenicians, who survived the collapse more intact than most of the Aegean civilizations, rebuilt the maritime trade network of the Eastern Mediterranean and carried the specific knowledge and practices of the Bronze Age world, including, crucially, the idea of an alphabet, into the Iron Age. The Egyptians, diminished but persistent, continued to maintain their civilization through the Third Intermediate Period and into the Late Period, all the way to Cleopatra and beyond. Something survived. Not the specific system that had been there before. That was gone, thoroughly and irreversibly gone. The palace economies and the linear B writing and the oxide copper ingots and the specific diplomatic language of the Amarna letters. But the people survived, and in surviving they carried forward fragments of the world that had been, and from those fragments built something new that was different from what had been before, but was not nothing. The tablets of Ugarit, hardened by the fire that destroyed the palace, preserved for 3,000 years in the debris of the destruction, excavated and read and understood by scholars who spent their careers learning a language that had been dead since the Bronze Age. These tablets are themselves a kind of survival. Not the survival of the civilization that produced them, which is gone, but the survival of the specific human acts, the writing of the letters, the maintenance of the commercial records, the training of the scribes, the telling of the stories that constituted the civilization's intellectual life. The tablets survived because the fire that destroyed the palace preserved them. The destruction was also the preservation. This is the specific, paradoxical gift of the Bronze Age collapse to those of us who study it. It shows us, in unusually clear form, what it looks like when the world ends. And in showing us that, it also shows us what survives. The specific fragility and the specific resilience, the things that disappeared and the things that persisted, the silence after the last letter and the new words that eventually filled it. The king of Ugarit is writing his last letter. The scribes are copying their documents into the archive. The merchants are counting their goods in the storehouses. The ships are somewhere else, in Lycia, in the land of the Hittites, and they are not coming back. The fire is coming, and in 3,000 years, someone will read the letter. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me go back into the world before the end. I have described the collapse and its causes, but I have not given you the texture of the late Bronze Age world at its height, what it felt like to live in it, what it looked like, what made it worth describing as one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world had yet produced. Because the collapse is only meaningful in proportion to what was lost, and what was lost was extraordinary. The palace of Knossos at the height of its power, around 1500 BCE. The building that the archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated, beginning in 1900, and that he partly reconstructed, controversially, in ways that later archaeologists have criticized for overinterpreting the evidence, was already 4 or 5 centuries old, when the Minoans were at their peak, rebuilt and expanded over generations into a complex of connected rooms and storage areas and light wells and lustral basins spread across several acres of the central Cretan hillside. The frescoes that decorated its walls are among the most vivid objects from the Bronze Age world, the dolphins swimming in the blue-painted ocean of the Queen's Chamber, the processions of gift-bearers with their lily-crowned heads, the young men and women performing the bull leaping that was apparently a central ritual of Minoan culture, gripping the horns of the charging bull and vaulting over its back. We do not know what the Minoans called themselves. The name Minoan was given to them by Arthur Evans, derived from the legendary king Minos of Crete, who appears in the later Greek myths. The language they wrote, the script called Linear A, which preceded the Mycenaean Linear B, and which was the specific writing system of the Minoan administration, has not been deciphered. The civilization that produced the Knossos frescoes and the extraordinary polychrome pottery and the specific religious imagery of double axes and sacred horns of consecration communicates with us only through its material remains, not through its words. We can see the dolphins and the bulls and the processions. We cannot hear the voice that named them. The Mycenaeans could read and write in Linear B, but what the Linear B tablets preserved was the administrative record of the palace economy, the inventories of livestock and grain and textiles and bronze, the allocations of resources, the records of workers and their obligations. Linear B was not used for literature or for theology or for narrative. It was an administrative tool, and what it has preserved for us is the ledger of a palace bureaucracy, precise and informative about the specific workings of the Mycenaean economy, and entirely silent about what the Mycenaeans thought about the world, what they believed about the gods, what stories they told each other in the great halls of their palaces. The stories they told each other, those stories survived in oral tradition through the Dark Ages and eventually became Homer. The warrior culture of the Iliad, with its specific code of honor and its specific relationship to death and glory, and the judgment of posterity, is recognizably Bronze Age in its assumptions about what matters and why. The specific grief of Achilles at the death of Patroclus, the specific dignity of Priam begging for his son's body, the specific longing of Odysseus for home after years of wandering. These are not the inventions of an 8th century BC poet constructing his characters out of nothing. They are the specific emotional inheritance of a culture that had been thinking about these things for centuries, that had been telling these stories in its great halls, and whose oral tradition was old enough to preserve, across the dark centuries of the collapse, the specific emotional register of the Bronze Age world's relationship to heroism and loss. The Hittites. I want to spend time with the Hittites because they are one of the least known of the major Bronze Age civilizations and one of the most interesting. The Hittite Empire, at its peak in the 13th century BCE, controlled most of Anatolia and significant parts of Syria, and was one of the three major powers of the late Bronze Age world alongside Egypt and the Kingdom of Mitanni and, later, Babylonia. The Hittites were the first major iron-using culture in the ancient Near East. Not the Iron Age culture of smelted iron, but the specific use of meteoritic iron and of small amounts of smelted iron for luxury and prestige objects, and their military technology was advanced enough to fight the Egyptian army under Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles in history, to a genuine standstill, leading to the first written peace treaty in recorded history. The Hittite capital of Hattusa in north-central Anatolia has been excavated since the late 19th century, and the archive of clay tablets found there is one of the richest collections of ancient Near Eastern documents outside Mesopotamia. The tablets include the religious texts of the Hittite pantheon, a remarkably diverse theological tradition that incorporated gods from the many cultures the Hittites had absorbed or conquered, producing a cosmological system of extraordinary complexity. They include the legal records and the administrative documents that govern the empire's day-to-day operations, and they include the diplomatic correspondence, the letters to and from Egypt, to and from Babylon, to and from Ugarit, that documents the specific interstate relationships of the late Bronze Age international system. The Hittite diplomatic language, like that of all the major Bronze Age powers, was Akkadian. The Egyptian pharaoh and the Hittite king wrote to each other in Akkadian, a Semitic language native to Mesopotamia that had become, over centuries of commercial and diplomatic use, the common language of the ancient Near East in the same way that Latin would become the common language of medieval Europe and French would become the common language of early modern European diplomacy. The specific cultural weight of this choice, that the Egyptian pharaoh, speaking Egyptian, and the Hittite king, speaking Hittite, communicated with each other in a third language, in the language of the Babylonian scribes who mediated their diplomacy, tells us something important about the late Bronze Age world's understanding of itself as a multi-ethnic, multicultural international system that needed shared conventions to function. The Great Archive of Amarna letters, found in Egypt in 1887, is the most extensive surviving collection of this diplomatic correspondence. The Amarna Archive, named for the site in Egypt where Akhenaten built his new capital during his religious revolution, contains hundreds of clay tablets preserving the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court with the rulers of the other major powers of the period and with the minor rulers of the Levantine city-states who were under Egyptian suzerainty. The letters cover everything from the major political relationships between great powers to the specific commercial transactions and personal requests that characterize the less formal aspects of Bronze Age diplomacy. The letters between great kings use the specific language of fraternity. The Egyptian pharaoh and the Hittite king address each other as brothers, and the language of brotherhood encodes a specific diplomatic fiction that the two rulers are of equal status, that their relationship is one of equality and mutual respect rather than domination and submission. The fiction was maintained through specific diplomatic conventions, the exchange of gifts, the acknowledgement of the other ruler's greatness, the specific protocols of address that preserved the appearance of equality even when the underlying power relationship was not, in fact, equal. This is sophisticated diplomacy. It is the specific practical wisdom of people who understood that maintaining the fiction of equality was more useful than insisting on the reality of hierarchy, because the fiction allowed relationships to continue that the reality would disrupt. And then there are the letters from the minor rulers, the kings of the Levantine city-states, the governors of Egyptian-controlled territories, and these letters have a completely different register, simultaneously more desperate and more revealing. Ribhuda, the king of Byblos in what is now Lebanon, wrote dozens of letters to the Egyptian pharaoh during the Amarna period, each more urgent than the last, warning of the incursions of the Habiru, nomadic or semi-nomadic groups who were encroaching on the settled territories and begging for Egyptian troops and supplies to resist them. The pharaoh, absorbed in the theological revolution of Akhenaten's reign, did not respond effectively. Ribhuda's letters became progressively more desperate, and then they stopped. The silence of the archive, where a correspondent's letters used to arrive, is itself a historical event. The Bronze Age world was full of Ribhudas, rulers of smaller polities, caught between the great powers, dependent on the support of patrons who were too distant or too absorbed in their own affairs to help. The specific vulnerability of the small state, too small to defend itself independently, too large to be overlooked by the great powers, is as old as the Bronze Age and remains as relevant as the morning news. Ribhuda's letters, with their mixture of diplomatic convention and genuine urgency, are documents from a recognizable world, the world of the smaller power appealing to the larger for help that may or may not come, the amber and the tin. The specific network of the Bronze Age trade extended further than most people imagine. Further, certainly, than the Mediterranean and the Near East that are the primary focus of the historical record. The amber that appears in Bronze Age contexts across the Mediterranean, in Egyptian palace contexts, in Minoan Crete, in Mycenaean tombs, came from the Baltic coast of what is now northern Poland and the Baltic states, carried south overland through Central Europe by trade networks that are visible only in the distribution of amber objects and in occasional finds along the trade routes. The tin that made the Bronze Age possible came from sources that are still debated, but the most distant proposed sources include Afghanistan and Britain. And even if the British tin hypothesis is disputed, the Afghan tin would have required trade networks extending from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Oxus Valley, a distance of thousands of miles. These distant connections are important because they mean that the Bronze Age collapse, when it disrupted the trade networks, disrupted connections that extended far beyond the obvious centers of the collapse. The communities in Central Europe that had participated in the amber trade experienced the cessation of that trade as a specific economic event. The communities in Afghanistan or Anatolia that had supplied the tin experienced the same. The collapse was not a local event. It was a shock that propagated through a network that extended across much of the known world of the time, the ships on the sea. The specific technology of the late Bronze Age maritime trade, the ships that carried the goods between the palace economies, is known to us primarily through two sources, the Uluburun shipwreck and the scenes of ships depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings and on the Aegean pottery of the period. The ships were wooden, constructed of timber that was increasingly scarce in the deforested eastern Mediterranean of the Bronze Age, and they were powered by both sail and oar. They navigated primarily by coastal sailing, staying in sight of land as much as possible, using the knowledge of specific capes and anchorages and weather patterns that the experienced mariners of the period accumulated over careers spent on the eastern Mediterranean routes. The crew of the Uluburun ship, the ship that sank around 1300 BCE with its extraordinary cargo, can be partially characterized from the personal objects found in the wreck. The presence of objects from multiple cultural traditions, Mycenaean, Canaanite, Egyptian, suggests a multicultural crew, or at least a crew that carried objects from multiple cultural traditions. The specific personal possessions, the jewelry, the tools, the weapons, suggest people of some means, not the desperately poor, but working professionals with specific skills and specific possessions that reflected the specific cultures they came from and the specific trade they were in. What happened to them when the ship went down? The Uluburun wreck shows no evidence of a violent attack. The cargo appears undisturbed, not looted, which suggests that if there were survivors, they could not recover what the sea had taken or chose not to try. The ship sank, probably in a sudden storm off a dangerous cape in southwestern Turkey. The crew died or swam to shore. The cargo went to the bottom, and there it waited for 3,000 years for the sponge diver who would find it and the archaeologists who would spend decades recovering its contents. The specific object from the Uluburun wreck that I find most moving is not the ton of tin or the 10 tons of copper or the gold scarab of Nefertiti. It is a set of writing boards, wooden boards coated with wax and hinged together with ivory hinges, designed to be written on with a stylus and then closed and reopened, like a very early version of the notebook. The writing boards are blank. The wax was lost over the millennia of underwater preservation, but the boards themselves survived with their ivory hinges, and they tell us that someone on that ship, a merchant perhaps, or the ship's master, was literate, carried their records with them, expected to be writing and reading on this voyage. The blank boards are the absence of a record that was once present, the silence of information that was once there and is now gone, preserving only the form of its container, the human weight of the collapse. I want to try to bring the abstract patterns of the systemic failure down to the level of specific human beings, because the Bronze Age collapse was not experienced as a systemic failure by the people who lived through it. It was experienced as drought, as food shortage, as raiding, as the failure of the expected supplies to arrive, as the flight of neighbours, as fire, as death. The administrative language of the palace tablets, the precise inventories and the careful accounting, gives us the data of the system's functioning. But the human experience of the system's failure is harder to recover, because the people who experienced it were for the most part not the people who wrote the tablets. The farmer in the Mycenaean territory of the 13th century BCE, not the palace elite, not the specialist craftspeople, but the agricultural worker whose labour produced the surplus that the palace economy extracted and redistributed, experienced the beginning of the collapse not as a systemic failure, but as a sequence of bad harvests. One year the rain was late, the yield was lower than usual. The palace's demand for tribute was not reduced to reflect the lower yield. The farmer went hungry. The next year was worse. The year after that was worse still. The palace's demand for tribute continued, because the palace needed to meet its obligations, to the specialists it employed, to the military it maintained, to the religious establishments it supported. Regardless of what was happening in the countryside, at some point, and the specific moment is invisible to us in the archaeological record, the farmer stopped paying, or fled, or joined the groups of displaced people moving through the landscape in search of food and safety, or died. The palace's administrative records, up until the moment of the final destruction, continue to register the attempt to maintain the system. The watchers deployed on the coast, the rowers sent to the fleet, the specific administrative responses to a situation that was becoming unmanageable. and then the records stop because the palace burned and no one came to maintain the records afterward. The archaeologists' phrase for this is the collapse of the redistributive economy. It is an accurate description of what happened. It does not convey the weight of what it felt like to the people who experienced it, to live through the collapse of the system that had organized their world. The Iron Age that followed, the specific technological transition that gives the period after the collapse its name, the Iron Age, was not a cause of the collapse but a consequence of it. The Bronze Age trade networks had supplied the copper and tin that made bronze possible. When those networks ceased to function, bronze became unavailable, or at least much more expensive and difficult to obtain, and the communities that had previously made their tools and weapons of bronze needed to find an alternative. Iron was that alternative. Iron ore is more widely distributed geographically than copper and tin. It is available in most parts of Europe and the Near East and Africa, without the specific trade network that bronze required. The smelting technology for iron is different from that for bronze, and in some respects more demanding, requiring higher temperatures and more precise control of the carbon content of the metal. But iron, once the smelting technology was mastered, produced a metal that was harder and more versatile than bronze, and that could be produced locally rather than requiring long-distance trade. The Iron Age, in this sense, was not a technological advance in the simple progressive sense. It was an adaptation to the specific conditions of a world from which the Bronze Age trade network had been removed. The communities that figured out iron smelting did so because they had to, because the alternative was to continue using stone tools or to go without metal entirely. The technological step forward was driven by necessity, by the specific absence of the previous technology's supply chain, rather than by the specific desire for a better metal. The collapse left traces, not just the literal ruins, though the ruins are extraordinary, the cyclopean walls of Mycenaean and the stone terraces of Minoan Crete and the ash layers that mark the destructions, but the cultural traces, the way the memory of the Bronze Age world persisted into the Iron Age and shaped how the Iron Age understood itself and its past. The Homeric tradition is the most important of these cultural traces. The specific content of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the heroes and the gods and the places and the events, drew on a cultural memory of the Bronze Age that the oral tradition preserved across the Dark Ages. The palace of Alcinous in the Odyssey, with its gold and silver walls and its mechanical golden dogs, is a memory of the Mycenaean palace. Not a precise memory, not an architectural description, but the emotional memory of a place of extraordinary wealth and craft that no longer existed. The ships of the Iliad, the bronze weapons, the specific culture of the aristocratic warrior, all of these are the cultural memory of the Bronze Age world, preserved in oral tradition for 4 centuries and then written down by the Greek Iron Age. The memory was transformed in the transmission, inevitably. The Dark Age poets who maintained the oral tradition were not archaeologists trying to preserve an accurate record of the Bronze Age. They were storytellers working in their own cultural context, adapting the inherited material to the specific needs and sensibilities of their audiences, adding and subtracting and reinterpreting in the way that oral traditions always do. What they preserved was not the Bronze Age itself, but a creative engagement with the memory of it. And what they created from that engagement was one of the foundational documents of Western literature. This is the specific paradox of the Bronze Age collapse's cultural legacy. The collapse destroyed the Bronze Age world, but in destroying it, it created the conditions for the preservation of a specific cultural memory of that world, and from that memory came Homer, and from Homer came the specific tradition that Greeks called their own, and that shaped the Western intellectual tradition in ways that continue to the present. The ships stopped coming, and the palaces burned, and in the centuries of poverty that followed, the storytellers kept the stories alive, and the stories eventually became the Iliad and the Odyssey, and those texts are still being read. The last letter from Ugarit. The king writes his urgent plea and includes it in the archive. The fire comes. The tablets are preserved by the fire that destroyed the palace. 3,000 years later, someone reads the letter. The world that produced the letter is gone. The world that preserved it is also gone. The specific world of early modern archaeology and the specific institutions and the specific scholarly tradition that developed the ability to read cuneiform and excavate ancient sites. That world continues in changed form, and the scholars who read the letter are the heirs of a tradition that is itself centuries old now, but the letter is still there. The urgency is still there, the specific human desperation, the recognition that something terrible is happening, and there is nothing to be done, is as present in the tablet as it was when the scribe cut the cuneiform signs into the clay. Time did not diminish it. The fire that destroyed the palace preserved it, and in that preservation, the king of Ugarit's last words reached an audience he could not have imagined, in a world he could not have conceived, speaking a language that no one has spoken for 3,000 years. The world ends. The letters survive. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me give you the specific cities one by one, because the collapse was not a single event in a single place. It was a sequence of endings, spread across decades, each one a specific civilization, reaching its specific final moment. And each of those endings happened to specific people in specific places, and the specific character of each ending tells us something different about the nature of what was destroyed. Mycenaean, the city of Agamemnon, or the city that Homer's tradition associates with Agamemnon, the most powerful of the Achaean kings who sailed to Troy, sits on a rocky hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, dominating the route between the Argive plain and the coast. The Lion Gate, the famous entrance to the citadel, is made of stones so large that the later Greeks, unable to imagine human beings moving them, attributed the construction to the Cyclopes. The walls of the citadel, what the archaeologists call the Cyclopean masonry, are built of limestone blocks, some of them weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar in the specific Mycenaean style. The shaft graves inside the citadel, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876, contained gold death masks, bronze weapons, amber beads from the Baltic, ostrich eggs from Africa. The specific material wealth of the Mycenaean elite at the height of their power. Mycenae was destroyed. The archaeological evidence shows a destruction layer with fire, at some point around 1200 BCE, or shortly after. Unlike Ugarit, it was not completely abandoned. There is evidence of continued habitation in the citadel after the destruction, though at a much reduced level. But the palace was gone. The administrative apparatus was gone. The specific way of life that had filled the shaft graves and built the Lion Gate and maintained the elaborate bureaucratic records of the Linear B tablets, that was gone. What continued after the destruction was something diminished and different. A community surviving in the ruins of a more ambitious past. The specific moment of destruction at Mycenae is visible in the archaeology in a way that is both revealing and unsatisfying. The destruction layer is there, the fire is evident in the charred materials. But we cannot say who set the fire. We cannot say whether it was the Sea Peoples or the Dorians, the Greek-speaking group that later tradition associated with the displacement of the Mycenaeans, or internal revolt, or simple abandonment with accidental burning, or some combination of these. The evidence tells us that there was fire. It does not tell us who brought it. Tiryns. 15 kilometers from Mycenae, on the Argive plain closer to the coast, Tiryns was another major Mycenaean citadel, in some ways more impressive than Mycenae in the specific massiveness of its walls, which are so thick that rooms and corridors are built within the walls themselves. Tiryns was destroyed at roughly the same time as Mycenae, and like Mycenae, it shows evidence of limited continued occupation after the destruction. The palace with its frescoed walls, fragments of the Tiryns frescoes survive, showing processions and chariot scenes similar to those of Mycenae, was gone. The Linear B administrative system was gone, but people continued to live there. The specific pattern of the Mycenaean collapse, destruction of the palaces and the end of the palace economies, but continued habitation by reduced populations in or near the old sites, suggests something about the nature of the collapse in the Aegean. It was not a depopulation event in the absolute sense. It was a collapse of the specific economic and administrative system, the palace economy, that had organized and sustained the Mycenaean civilization. The people who survived continued to live in the landscape, but without the institutions that had given the landscape its specific character. The archaeologists' term for what followed is post-palatial. Not a new civilization, but the absence of what had defined the old one, the landscape of the palace without the palace. Pylos. The palace at Pylos in the western Peloponnese has the richest archive of Linear B tablets of any Mycenaean site, and it has yielded the most detailed picture of the Mycenaean administrative system in its final phase. The palace was destroyed by fire around 1180 BCE, and unlike Mycenaean Tiryns, Pylos shows no evidence of continued occupation after the destruction. The people left and did not come back. The palace burned and was not rebuilt. The Linear B tablets from Pylos that date to the period immediately before the destruction, the records of the coastal watchers, the deployment of the rowers, the allocation of bronze from the sanctuary fittings to be made into weapons, give us the specific picture of a palace administration in crisis mode, using every resource at its disposal to prepare for a threat it could apparently see coming. And then the records stop, because the threat arrived and the palace burned, and the tablets that recorded the preparations for defense were preserved by the fire that defeated that defense. This is the specific tragedy of the Pylos archive. The tablets that survived are the tablets of the last days, the desperate administrative record of a palace that was trying to save itself and failed, the routine records of better times, the inventories of goods traded in normal commerce, the correspondence with other palace administrations, the records of the religious festivals that organized the palace's year. Those are gone too, lost in the fires of earlier destructions, or simply not preserved by chance. What we have is the crisis. The normal life of the palace is gone, and what remains is the record of its ending. Troy. I cannot discuss the Bronze Age collapse without Troy, because Troy is the most famous city of the Bronze Age world, and because the question of the relationship between the Trojan War of Homer's tradition and the archaeological site at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, the site that Schliemann identified as Troy, and that subsequent excavation has confirmed as a significant Bronze Age settlement, is one of the most productive and most contested questions in ancient history. The site of Hisarlik shows multiple occupation layers, and the layer that most scholars associate with the historical Troy, Troy the Sevender, was destroyed by fire at some point around 1180 BCE, within the general period of the Bronze Age collapse. There is evidence of violent destruction, including arrowheads embedded in the walls and human skeletal remains in contexts that suggest they were not buried with care. The destruction of Troy the Seventer may be a historical event behind the Trojan War tradition. It may be one of many violent destructions that occurred across the Eastern Mediterranean in the same period, preserved in Greek cultural memory because of the specific geographic and commercial importance of the Trojan site, which controlled the entrance to the Bosphorus and therefore the trade routes between the Aegean and the Black Sea, or it may be something else entirely. The relationship between the Homeric tradition and the historical record is not straightforward, and the specific claim that the Iliad preserves memories of historical events is contested by scholars who emphasize the mythological and literary dimensions of the text. What I want to say about Troy in the context of the Bronze Age collapse is not that the Trojan War certainly happened or certainly did not happen, but that the site was there and the site was destroyed, and the destruction happened in the same historical moment as all the other destructions. Whether or not Agamemnon's fleet was responsible for the destruction of Troy's Seventer, the destruction of Troy's Seventer was a Bronze Age collapse event, part of the same system-wide failure that destroyed Ugarit and the Mycenaean palaces and the Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire. I have mentioned the Hittites several times without giving them the attention they deserve. The Hittite Empire at its peak controlled most of Anatolia, the largest single territory of any Bronze Age power in the region. Its capital, Hattusa, was a city of perhaps 50,000 people, large by Bronze Age standards, with a palace complex, temples and administrative buildings spread across a naturally defensible site in the North Anatolian Plateau. The Hittite Empire was destroyed around 1200 BCE, the capital burned and abandoned, and never rebuilt. The Hittites, as an imperial power, simply ceased to exist. What happened to the Hittite Empire? The specific answer is not entirely clear, and it may be the most dramatic example of the multiple cause hypothesis that characterizes Bronze Age collapse scholarship in general. The empire had been weakening for some time. There were succession crises in the late 13th century, the specific problem of the Assyrian Empire to the east absorbing some of the Hittite vassal territories, and possibly internal revolts in some of the empire's peripheral territories. The Sea People's attacks may have struck from the south and west, and the climate data suggests that the specific area of Anatolia where the Hittite heartland was located experienced significant drought in the late 13th and early 12th centuries. One letter from the Hittite archive, a communication from a Hittite official to the king of Ugarit, is particularly striking. It asks for a ship to be sent with large quantities of grain, saying that the situation is a matter of life and death, and that the land of Hatti is dying of famine. The people of Hatti, the official writes, are dying of famine. This is not the proud language of the empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh. This is desperation, the specific hunger of a population that had been fed by the palace redistribution system and was now discovering that the system could not feed them. The specific collapse of the Hittite Empire was catastrophic in the literal sense, sudden, total, complete. Other Bronze Age civilizations declined before they collapsed, showing evidence of degradation over decades. The Hittite Empire seems to have held together until it did not, and when it did not, it was gone thoroughly. The Hittite language, which had been one of the administrative and literary languages of the ancient Near East for centuries, ceased to be used within a generation of the empire's fall. The Hittite people, or at least the Hittite-speaking population that maintained the specific literary and administrative tradition, dispersed or were absorbed by the succeeding populations of Anatolia. The specific Hittite civilization, the cuneiform tablets, the hieroglyphic inscriptions, the distinctive Hittite art style, the elaborate Hittite pantheon with its 1,000 gods, all of this ceased within the space of a generation or two. The survivors of Hattusa, the people who were there when the palace burned and who did not die in the burning, what did they do? Where did they go? We have no record because the records burned with everything else. We know from the archaeology that the site was not immediately reoccupied in any significant way, that the population of the surrounding area appears to have declined dramatically in the period after the collapse. We know that some of the cities that had been Hittite vassal states in Syria continue to use Hittite hieroglyphic writing for several more centuries, the so-called Neo-Hittite states of the Iron Age, preserving something of the Hittite cultural tradition in a reduced and transformed form. But the empire itself, the specific institution that had organized the Hittite world, was gone. Cyprus. The island of Lycia, Cyprus, occupies a special position in the Bronze Age collapse because it was both a victim of the collapse and, in some ways, a refuge from it. The Cypriot cities of Enkomi and Kichurn and Citium show destruction layers from the collapse period, but Cyprus also shows, in the same period, the arrival of new populations, people with Aegean cultural traditions using Mycenaean pottery and maintaining Mycenaean burial practices, who appear to have migrated to Cyprus from the Aegean as the Mycenaean palace system collapsed. Cyprus, in other words, received some of the refugees from the Mycenaean collapse, even while experiencing its own version of the collapse. This pattern, the migrant who is also the destroyer, the refugee who is also the raider, the displaced person whose displacement creates further displacement in the place they move to, is one of the most important and most difficult aspects of the Bronze Age collapse to think about clearly. The Sea Peoples, who appear in the Egyptian records as a destroyer civilization, were themselves probably displaced people, groups who had been pushed out of their home territories by the same cascade of failures that was destroying the civilizations they then attacked. The violence of the collapse was partly the violence of desperate people doing desperate things: the farmer who could not pay tribute, the merchant who could not sell his goods, the soldier whose army had stopped paying him. And this makes the moral landscape of the collapse considerably more complex than the simple narrative of barbaric outsiders destroying sophisticated civilization. The recovery. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not a simple descent into poverty and simplicity. It was a period of adaptation and innovation, the discovery of iron smelting, the development of the Phoenician alphabet that would eventually become the writing system of the Western world, the slow rebuilding of trade networks on a new basis, the emergence of the Greek city-state as a form of political organization that proved far more resilient than the palace economy it replaced. The Greek Dark Ages were dark for a reason. They were genuinely impoverished, genuinely disconnected from the wider world, genuinely reduced in population and material culture. But they were also the period in which the oral tradition that preserved Homer was being maintained, in which the specific cultural inheritance of the Bronze Age was being transformed into something that could survive and eventually flourish in the changed conditions of the Iron Age. The Phoenicians and the alphabet. One of the most consequential developments of the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse was the development, by the Phoenicians, the Semitic-speaking people of the Lebanese coast who were among the survivors of the collapse, of the specific writing system that we call the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet was not the first writing system in the ancient world, and it descended through complex paths from the specific West Semitic writing traditions of the Bronze Age Levant. But it was the specific writing system that, through the Greek adaptation of it in the 9th or 8th century BCE and the subsequent Latin adaptation of the Greek, became the ancestor of virtually every writing system in the Western world. The letter you are reading right now, the specific shapes of the characters that encode the English language, descends through the Latin and the Greek from the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet descended from the writing traditions of the Bronze Age Levant. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed the palace economies and the administrative systems and the trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age, but it did not destroy the specific cultural knowledge of writing which survived in the Phoenician communities of the Lebanese coast and eventually transformed and simplified and democratized, became the writing of the Iron Age world and of everything that has come since. The world that ended gave us the alphabet we are using to describe its ending. The king of Ugarit's letter is still there. The specific cuneiform signs cut into the specific clay, the specific words. My ships are in Lycia. There is no grain. I have nothing to send, are still readable by the scholars who have learnt the language, by the handful of people in the world who can sit down with a photograph of the tablet and understand what it says. The urgency is still there. The desperation is still there. The specific human experience of watching your world end while writing the letter that asks for help that will not come, that is still there 3,000 years later, as present as the day it was written. We are not the late Bronze Age. We are the inheritors of everything that survived the Bronze Age collapse, the alphabet, the Homeric tradition, the specific cultural memory of the world that was, transformed through 4,000 years into the civilization we inhabit. The Iron Age that followed the collapse was the world that invented, eventually, the specific forms of political organization and intellectual life that we call the Western tradition. But the late Bronze Age world, the world of the Olubaran ship and the Amarna letters and the Knossos frescoes and the Linear B tablets and the king of Ugarit writing his last desperate letter, that world is gone. Not merely transformed, gone. The specific integration that made it what it was, the palace economies and the trade networks and the international diplomatic system and the writing traditions, cannot be recovered, because it was not merely a set of practices that could be maintained by survivors. It was a system, and when the system collapsed, the system was over. The letter was never answered. The fire came, and in 3,000 years, someone read the letter, and in doing so, gave the king of Ugarit something he could not have imagined asking for. Not the ships and the grain that might have saved his city, but the specific permanence of being remembered, of having his final words read and understood across the full depth of time. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.